The morning of September 12, 1944, near the village of Hatton in the Alsace region, the fog clung to the earth like wet wool. Lieutenant Karl Heinemann crouched behind the stone wall of a farmhouse, his field glasses trained on the tree-line 400 meters to the west. He'd been ordered to hold this position with his platoon from the 358th Volksgrenadier Division. 32 men spread thin along a ridge that overlooked the main road to Strasbourg. The orders were simple. Delay the American advance. Buy time for the Panzer reserves to reposition. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But what troubled Heinemann wasn't the American Shermans rumbling somewhere beyond the forest. It was the Jeep. He'd seen it twice now. A tiny olive-drab speck, open-topped, moving along the valley road below with deliberate slowness. No gun visible, no infantry support, just a driver and a man in the passenger seat who occasionally stopped, raised binoculars, and scribbled in a notebook. To Heinemann, it looked absurd. A farmer's toy in a landscape of steel and fire. Then the world exploded. Within 90 seconds, 12 American 105mm shells tore through the German position. Fragments ripped through sandbags, shredded telephone wires, and turned the farmhouse into rubble. 3 men died instantly. 7 more lay screaming in the mud. And before Heinemann could even comprehend what had happened, the Jeep was gone, vanished like smoke into the morning haze. The Germans called them artillery Lenker, artillery directors. The Americans called them forward observers. And by the autumn of 1944, these unarmored Jeeps, crewed by 2 men with nothing but radios and mathematics, had become the most lethal force multiplier on the Western Front. Not because of what they carried, but because of what they could summon. The paradox was brutal. The Wehrmacht, with its tradition of massed artillery dating back to Verdun, found itself systematically dismantled by an enemy whose observers moved faster, communicated better, and struck with a precision that defied every assumption about modern warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Jeep itself was never meant for this role. The Willis MB, weighing just 2,450 pounds, had been designed in 1940 as a quartermaster's runabout, a vehicle to haul supplies and ferry officers between command posts. Its 60-horsepower Go Devil engine produced barely enough torque to climb a steep hill with a full load. Its top speed on flat ground was 55 miles per hour. It had no armor. Its canvas roof provided shelter from rain, but nothing else. German intelligence reports from 1943 dismissed it as logistically useful but tactically irrelevant. Yet by D-Day, every American artillery battalion in the European theater operated with Jeep-mounted forward observer teams. Each team consisted of a forward observer officer, typically a lieutenant or captain, a radio operator, and a driver. Their vehicle carried an SCR 619 radio, a 12-pound frequency-modulated transceiver that could transmit on the 27 to 39 MHz band with a reliable range of 5 miles. The Jeep also carried binoculars, topographic maps printed on waterproof paper, compass, rangefinder, and a signal core field telephone for connecting to wire networks when available. The genius wasn't in the equipment. It was in the system behind it. American artillery doctrine had undergone a revolutionary transformation during the interwar period at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, under the guidance of Colonel Carlos Brewer and his instructors at the Field Artillery School. They abandoned the World War I practice of individual battery fire control and instead developed the Fire Direction Center, a centralized command post at the battalion level that could coordinate the fire of multiple batteries on a single target with unprecedented speed and accuracy. The Fire Direction Center, universally known by its acronym FDC, operated as a clearinghouse for targeting data. When a forward observer called in a fire mission, his transmission went not to a single gun battery, but to the FDC, where trained specialists computed firing solutions using graphical firing tables, protractors, and slide rules, accounting for weather, ammunition lot variations, barrel wear, and propellant temperature. Within minutes, the FDC could transmit firing data to every howitzer within range of the target. More importantly, the system allowed one observer to call down fire from multiple battalions simultaneously, a capability no other army possessed. The Wehrmacht's artillery, by contrast, remained decentralized. German forward observers, the Vorgescabine Beobachter, used field telephones to communicate directly with their battery commanders. They calculated distance by pacing off the meters between their position and the battery, then estimating range to the target by eye and with optical rangefinders. The system worked, but it was slow, inflexible, and limited to the guns of a single battery. When telephone wires were cut by shellfire, or when observers were forced to move quickly, the entire system collapsed. This disparity became catastrophic in the mobile warfare of 1944. After the breakout from Normandy in late July, American armored and infantry divisions advanced at speeds that left German defensive doctrine in tatters. Forward observers in their jeeps moved with the leading elements, sometimes ahead of them, identifying targets of opportunity and calling down fire with a speed that German troops found incomprehensible. A typical fire mission began with the observer identifying a target. German infantry in a tree line, a half-track column moving along a road, an artillery battery setting up in an orchard. The observer would estimate the target's grid coordinates using his map and compass, determine the nature of the target, and transmit a standardized call for fire. The transmission took less than 30 seconds. Grid coordinates, target description, ammunition recommendation. The request went directly to the FDC via the Jeep's radio. At the FDC, specialists plotted the target on a firing chart, a large-scale map mounted on a wooden board. They calculated range, deflection, and quadrant elevation for each gun, accounting for the observer's position, the target's coordinates, and non-standard conditions like wind, temperature, and humidity. These calculations, which would have taken minutes using manual arithmetic, were completed in seconds using pre-computed graphical tables. The FDC then transmitted firing data to the gun batteries. The entire process, from observer's call to first round fired, averaged 90 seconds. The first round was an adjustment. The observer watched where it landed, calculated the error in meters, and transmitted corrections. Left 200. Add 100. The FDC adjusted the data and transmitted a new firing solution. The second round landed closer. The observer called fire for effect. Every gun in the battalion, typically 12 105mm howitzers, fired 3 rounds in rapid succession. 36 shells impacted the target area within 60 seconds. Then silence. The Jeep moved to a new position, and the observer scanned for the next target. From the German perspective, it was as if the Americans possessed supernatural awareness. A panzer column would halt to refuel in a clearing presumed safe, only to be bracketed by artillery within minutes. Infantry attempting to dig defensive positions would come under fire before they completed their foxholes. Supply convoys moving at night, with vehicles spaced 100 meters apart and headlights off, would be destroyed with such precision that survivors suspected betrayal by spies or collaborators. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. The Jeeps were everywhere. They infiltrated gaps in German lines, positioned themselves on ridges and in church steeples, and maintained constant radio contact with their FDCs. They operated in pairs or alone, relying on speed and stealth rather than armor. When German troops attempted to engage them with small arms or machine gun fire, the Jeeps simply drove away, often at speeds the Wehrmacht's heavy vehicles couldn't match on rough terrain. A captured German operations officer, interrogated near Metz in November 1944, admitted that his regiment had lost more men to American artillery in 2 weeks than to all other causes combined in the previous month. "We could see the little trucks," he said, "but we could not catch them. They moved like water through cracks, and wherever they went, the shells followed." The mobility of the Jeep was matched only by its vulnerability. Forward observers operated with the knowledge that discovery meant death. German doctrine prioritized eliminating enemy artillery observers above almost all other tactical targets. Snipers hunted them. Mortar teams targeted them. When German artillery managed to achieve local superiority, their first missions were counter-battery fire and suppression of observation posts. The life expectancy of a forward observer in heavy combat was measured in weeks, not months. Yet the system persisted because it worked. American artillery, firing under the direction of Jeep-mounted observers, achieved a volume and accuracy of fire that German forces could neither match nor endure. Statistical analyses conducted after the war revealed that American artillery in the European theater fired more rounds per gun per day than any other combatant, while achieving better accuracy due to the FDC system's precise fire control. By the autumn of 1944, Wehrmacht operational reports from the Western Front reflected a growing obsession with the American artillery system. Unit commanders noted that American infantry seemed reluctant to advance without overwhelming fire support. But when that support arrived, it arrived with a weight and precision that made German defensive positions untenable. Staff officers at Army Group B headquarters compiled detailed studies of captured American fire control documents, attempting to understand how the system worked and how it might be countered. The answer they found was unsettling. The system was not built around technological superiority. American radios were reliable, but not dramatically more advanced than German equipment. American guns, the M2, a 105mm howitzer, and the M1 155mm gun, were excellent weapons, but not markedly superior to German artillery pieces. The advantage lay entirely in organization, training, and the speed of communication enabled by radio nets that linked every element from observer to gun. German artillery, hamstrung by fuel shortages, ammunition rationing, and the constant attrition of Allied air superiority, could not respond in kind. By late 1944, Wehrmacht artillery batteries frequently displaced to avoid counter-battery fire, moved only at night, and rationed shells to extend dwindling supplies. Forward observers, when they could be deployed at all, often operated without functioning radios, relying on runners or fragile telephone lines that Allied artillery severed with depressing regularity. The Jeeps, meanwhile, multiplied. American production had delivered more than 640,000 Willis MBs and 4 GPWs by 1945, approximately 1 Jeep for every 50 American soldiers worldwide. In the European theater, forward observer teams were augmented by aerial observers flying in Piper L-4 light aircraft, whose pilots coordinated with Jeep-mounted observers to provide overlapping coverage of enemy positions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The combination was devastating. A German battalion commander trying to reposition his units under fire faced a cruel calculus. Movement drew observation. Observation brought shells. Shells meant casualties and chaos. Remaining static invited the same result, only slower. The psychological toll was immense. German infantry learned to dread the appearance of American jeeps on distant ridges, knowing that within minutes, the earth would erupt. One account from a Wehrmacht medical officer stationed near Aachen in October 1944 described the aftermath of an American artillery barrage that lasted 18 minutes. His aid station received 47 casualties, 31 of whom died before receiving treatment. The wounds were catastrophic. Shrapnel from high-explosive shells inflicted injuries that even morphine couldn't soften. Men missing limbs. Men with abdominal wounds leaking intestines. Men whose faces had been erased by blast pressure. The medical officer noted in his report that most of the dead had been killed by the first salvo before they could reach cover. The Jeep, he wrote, had been visible on the horizon for perhaps 90 seconds before the shells arrived. The Wehrmacht's attempts to counter the Jeep-mounted observers revealed the depth of their predicament. In December 1944, the German 15th Army issued tactical guidance to subordinate units regarding American artillery observation procedures. The directive, captured near Düren and later translated by Allied intelligence, read like a confession of impotence. It acknowledged that American observers operated with extraordinary freedom of movement, that their radio communications were difficult to intercept or jam, and that attempts to suppress them with counterfire were largely ineffective due to the speed with which they relocated after calling missions. The document recommended that German units maintain strict light discipline, minimize movement during daylight hours, and disperse forces to reduce the effectiveness of massed artillery fire. These were defensive measures born of desperation, not tactical innovation. They represented an admission that the Wehrmacht could no longer contest American superiority in artillery coordination. The Jeep, invisible in the grand narratives of tank battles and infantry assaults, had become the critical node in a system that was systematically destroying German combat power. The technical specifications of the SCR-619 radio tell part of the story. The set consisted of a BC-1335 transceiver weighing 35 pounds, powered by a dynamotor that drew current from the Jeep's electrical system. It transmitted and received on 10 preset channels within the 27 to 39 MHz band using frequency modulation, which provided better clarity and resistance to interference than the amplitude modulation systems used by most German tactical radios. The antenna, a steel whip mounted on the Jeep's rear bumper, could be tilted horizontal when moving through wooded terrain to prevent snagging on branches. The radio's effective range varied with terrain and atmospheric conditions, but under normal circumstances, a forward observer could maintain contact with his battalion FDC at distances up to 8 miles. This range exceeded the effective firing distance of most German weapons that might threaten the Jeep, creating a tactical bubble within which observers could operate with relative safety. When enemy forces did approach, the Jeep's mobility allowed rapid withdrawal to a new position, often before German troops could bring effective fire to bear. The human cost of this system fell heavily on both sides, but asymmetrically. American forward observers suffered casualty rates higher than infantry riflemen, with some estimates suggesting that in heavy combat, observer teams experienced losses approaching 20% per month. Yet the system produced artillery effectiveness that saved far more American lives than it cost. German casualties from American artillery, by contrast, mounted relentlessly throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe. British medical analysis of German prisoners of war and casualties during the period from June to December 1944 indicated that approximately 75% of German battle wounds were caused by artillery and mortar fire, compared to roughly 10% from small arms. While this data reflected all artillery systems, not solely those coordinated by Jeep-mounted observers, the proportion underscores the dominance of indirect fire in the European theater. American artillery, firing more shells with greater accuracy than any other force, was responsible for the majority of these casualties. The story of Lieutenant Robert Harmon of the 29th Infantry Division illustrates the system in practice. On December 3, 1944, near Koslar, Germany, Harmon's observer team occupied a damaged church tower overlooking the Rohr River Valley. From this position, he could observe German positions in depth, including a road junction where enemy supply traffic moved during twilight hours. Over a period of 7 hours, Harmon called in 14 separate fire missions, engaging targets that included infantry positions, supply trucks, and what he identified as possible artillery observers in a windmill 3 kilometers distant. His radio operator, Corporal James Wheeler, maintained constant communication with the battalion FDC, transmitting grid coordinates and ammunition recommendations while Harmon observed the fall of shot through his binoculars. The Jeep remained hidden in the ruins behind the church, engine running in case rapid withdrawal became necessary. By nightfall, Harmon estimated his fires had destroyed or damaged at least 20 vehicles and inflicted casualties on several hundred German soldiers. His own team suffered no losses. The Jeep drove back to the battalion command post after dark, where Harmon filed his report and requested resupply of map sheets and pencils. This mundane efficiency characterized the system's operation throughout the campaign. There were no dramatic narratives, no individual heroics in the traditional sense. Just mathematically precise violence, delivered at distances that rendered the target helpless to respond. The Jeep enabled this system by providing the mobility, communication, and flexibility that static observation posts could not match. The Germans attempted various countermeasures. They deployed additional forward observers of their own, trained in American observation techniques, but lacked the radio infrastructure and ammunition supplies to achieve similar effectiveness. They experimented with radio direction finding equipment to locate American observer transmissions, but the brief duration of most fire missions and the mobility of the Jeeps made intercepts difficult. They prioritized counter-battery fire against suspected American artillery positions, but the FDC system allowed American guns to displace rapidly after firing, and the Wehrmacht's own ammunition shortages limited the volume of fire available for such missions. Some German units attempted to infiltrate American lines to ambush observer Jeeps, with limited success. In one documented incident near Hürtgen Forest in November 1944, A German reconnaissance patrol destroyed an American observer jeep with Panzerfaust fire, killing the crew. Yet such successes were rare and did little to degrade the overall effectiveness of the American artillery observation network. For every jeep destroyed, another took its place, and the system continued operating without interruption. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated both the vulnerability and the resilience of the jeep-based observation system. During the initial German offensive, poor weather grounded Allied aircraft and heavy fog limited visibility for ground observers. Several forward observer teams were overrun or forced to withdraw under the pressure of German armored columns. Yet, even in retreat, observers continued calling fire missions, directing artillery against German spearheads, and communicating enemy positions to higher headquarters. As American forces stabilized the front and weather cleared, the observation system reasserted its dominance. Jeep-mounted observers accompanied counterattacking infantry and armored units, calling down devastating fire on German forces that had outrun their supply lines and were vulnerable in exposed positions. American artillery fired more rounds during the Battle of the Bulge than in any previous campaign, and the accuracy of this fire, guided by forward observers, was instrumental in halting and then reversing the German advance. A German panzer officer captured near Bastogne in January 1945 provided a vivid account during interrogation. He described how his battalion, advancing toward Houffalize, came under sustained artillery fire that seemed to anticipate every movement. When the tanks halted, shells fell on their position. When they attempted to maneuver, shells followed them. When they sought cover in a tree line, the trees themselves became weapons as airbursts detonated above them, sending fragments downward into open hatches and crew positions. The officer stated that he never saw the observers directing the fire, only the small vehicles that appeared and disappeared on distant ridges like ghosts. The effectiveness of American artillery observation created a psychological burden that German commanders struggled to address. Training bulletins and tactical directives from early 1945 reflected an almost fatalistic acceptance that American artillery superiority could not be overcome through conventional means. Units were instructed to move only at night, to disperse forces to the maximum extent possible, and to avoid any action that might draw observation. These measures reduced casualties but also reduced combat effectiveness, creating a dilemma with no solution. By March 1945, as Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany proper, the jeep-mounted observation system had become so integrated into American tactical doctrine that infantry commanders planned operations with the assumption that overwhelming artillery support would be available on demand. This assumption proved correct. German defensive positions, already weakened by months of attrition and supply shortages, collapsed under artillery barrages that destroyed strongpoints, severed communications, and inflicted casualties that could not be replaced. The final statistics tell a stark story. American field artillery in the European theater fired approximately 96 million rounds between D-Day and V-Day, an average of more than 300,000 rounds per day. The vast majority of this fire was directed by forward observers, many of them operating from jeeps. German military casualties during the same period exceeded 1.5 million killed, wounded, and missing on the Western Front, with artillery responsible for the majority of combat deaths. The jeep itself, that improbable vehicle that German tankers had dismissed as a toy in 1943, had become the most feared symbol of American firepower by 1945, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. Every jeep on a distant hillside was a potential harbinger of annihilation. Every radio antenna glimpsed through binoculars was evidence that somewhere, invisible and untouchable, American guns were being trained on German positions. Lieutenant Heinemann, the German officer who had survived that morning bombardment near Hatton in September 1944, kept a diary throughout the war. The entries from late 1944 and early 1945 reflect a progressive disintegration of morale and confidence. He wrote about the constant fear of artillery, the way it dominated every tactical decision, the manner in which it transformed movement into suicide and static defense into slow death. In an entry dated February 7, 1945, he described watching an American Jeep through his field glasses, knowing that within minutes his position would come under fire, but unable to do anything to prevent it. The shells arrived as predicted. Heinemann survived again, but 7 of his men did not. He wrote that evening that the war had become incomprehensible, that the old certainties about courage and tactics had dissolved into a simple calculation of probability and bad luck. The Americans, he noted, did not need to see their enemies to destroy them. They only needed coordinates and radios, and they had both in abundance. After the war, military analysts from multiple nations studied the American artillery system, attempting to understand the factors that made it so effective. They identified the Fire Direction Center as the critical organizational innovation, the radio networks as the essential communication infrastructure, and the integration of forward observers with maneuver units as the tactical key. But they also recognized that the Jeep, that simple vehicle, had been the physical embodiment of a new doctrine that prioritized information and coordination over mass and momentum. The lessons learned from the Jeep-mounted observation system influenced artillery doctrine throughout the Cold War and beyond. The concept that mobility and communication could multiply firepower became foundational to military thinking in the second half of the 20th century. The descendants of those wartime observer Jeeps, equipped with digital communications and GPS-guided munitions, continued the mission their predecessors had pioneered on the ridges of France and Germany. For the Wehrmacht, the Jeep represented an inversion of their own military philosophy. German doctrine had always emphasized the primacy of the offensive, the importance of combined arms coordination, and the value of technological superiority. Yet they were defeated by an enemy whose artillery observers rode in unarmored trucks, armed with nothing but radios and mathematics, calling down fire with a precision and volume that German doctrine had never anticipated and could never match. The farmhouse near Hatton where Lieutenant Heinemann first encountered American artillery fire still stands, its walls pockmarked with fragment scars. The valley where the Jeep appeared that September morning is now farmland again, peaceful under a sky that no longer rains steel. But the story of what happened there, and in 10,000 similar locations across Western Europe, remains a testament to a paradox that defined modern warfare. The Wehrmacht feared the Sherman tank for its numbers, the P-47 Thunderbolt for its guns, and the strategic bombers for their capacity to destroy cities. But it was the Jeep, that small unarmored vehicle carrying 2 men and a radio, that killed more German soldiers than any other weapons system in the American arsenal. Not through its own firepower, but through its ability to summon fire from miles away with devastating accuracy. The Jeep didn't fight. It coordinated. And in the mathematics of industrial warfare, coordination proved deadlier tunder the technical superiority of the American system became most apparent in the details that surviving German documents reveal. A Wehrmacht after-action report from the 7th Army, dated January 18, 1945, analyzed 43 separate engagements where American artillery had been decisive. The report's author, whose name was redacted in captured documents, attempted to quantify the American advantage. He calculated that American forward observers achieved target acquisition and first-round impact in an average of 2 minutes and 15 seconds from initial observation. German observers, by comparison, required an average of 8 to 12 minutes to achieve similar results, assuming functioning communications and available ammunition. The report concluded with a recommendation that was never implemented. German artillery needed to adopt radio-based fire direction systems, establish centralized coordination at battalion level or higher, and prioritize the training of mobile forward observers. But by January 1945, such reforms were impossible. Germany lacked the radio production capacity, the fuel for mobile operations, the ammunition for sustained fire missions, and most critically, the time to retrain an artillery branch that was disintegrating under the weight of Allied offensives from east and west. The Jeeps continued their work with mechanical efficiency. In the Rhineland campaign of February and March 1945, American artillery fired more than 5 million rounds in support of operations to clear German forces west of the Rhine River. Forward observers, many of them now veterans with months of experience, had refined their craft to a grim artistry. They could estimate range by terrain association, call corrections by sound when visibility was poor, and coordinate fires from multiple battalions on targets that existed for only minutes before German forces displaced. One such observer, Captain Thomas Ridgely of the 4th Armored Division, kept detailed notes of his fire missions during the drive across southern Germany in April 1945. His records, preserved in the National Archives, document 87 separate missions called over a 3-week period. The targets ranged from individual machine gun nests to company-sized infantry formations to supply columns stretched along roads. Ridgely's notes are matter-of-fact, almost clerical. Grid coordinates, target descriptions, ammunition expended, estimated casualties. There is no drama in the writing, only the accumulated weight of industrial killing reduced to columns of figures. In one entry from April 9th, Ridgely described engaging a German artillery battery that had been harassing American infantry near Kralsheim. He observed the battery from a church steeple 2,000 meters distant, called a fire mission from his battalion's 12 guns, and watched as the German position disappeared under a barrage of high explosive and white phosphorus shells. The entire engagement lasted 11 minutes. Ridgely estimated 18 German casualties and destruction of at least 2 guns. His jeep withdrew from the observation post 17 minutes after arriving, long before any German counterfire could be organized. The cumulative effect of thousands of such engagements created a battlefield environment where German forces existed in a state of perpetual vulnerability. Movement invited observation. Observation brought fire. Fire meant death. This equation, simple and inescapable, dominated German tactical thinking in the war's final months. Units that had once maneuvered aggressively now hugged cover and moved only when absolutely necessary. Offensive operations became virtually impossible. Even defensive positions could be held only as long as they remained unobserved. The psychological dimension of this warfare manifested in ways that traditional military analysis struggles to capture. German soldiers developed what medical officers termed Granitzschock, shell shock, at rates that overwhelmed the already strained military medical system. Men who had endured years of combat on the Eastern Front, who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, broke under the sustained weight of American artillery in the West. The difference, they explained when they could articulate it, was the precision and the inevitability. Russian artillery was heavier and more numerous, but also more predictable, more survivable. American artillery felt targeted, personal, inescapable. A psychiatric evaluation of German prisoners conducted by American medical personnel in March 1945 found that nearly 40% of combat troops interviewed exhibited symptoms of severe stress reactions. When asked to identify their primary fear, the majority cited artillery fire specifically, and many mentioned the American observation system. One prisoner, a sergeant from the 352nd Volksgrenadier Division, stated that his men had begun calling the American observers Todesengel, death angels, and that the appearance of a jeep on a distant ridge produced panic reactions even among experienced soldiers. This fear was not irrational. It was a logical response to a tactical reality that offered no effective countermeasure. The Wehrmacht had built its doctrine around mobility, combined arms coordination, and aggressive maneuver. But these principles required freedom of movement and reliable communications, both of which had been systematically destroyed by Allied air superiority and artillery dominance. By the spring of 1945, German units in the West were reduced to reactive defensive operations characterized by retreat, surrender, or annihilation. The Jeep's role in this transformation cannot be overstated. Without mobile, radio-equipped forward observers, the American artillery system would have been significantly less effective. Static observation posts could be identified and suppressed. Observers moving on foot lacked the mobility to keep pace with armored advances. Only the Jeep provided the combination of speed, range, and communication capability necessary to exploit the full potential of the Fire Direction Center system. American logistics supported this capability with characteristic efficiency. The Jeep's fuel consumption, approximately 15 gallons per 100 miles under typical operating conditions, meant that a forward observer team could operate for days on the fuel carried in the vehicle's standard tank and a few jerry cans. Maintenance was simple enough that crew members could perform most repairs in the field. When jeeps were destroyed or damaged beyond repair, replacements arrived from depot stocks that seemed inexhaustible to German observers. This logistical depth reflected America's industrial capacity, but it also reflected a doctrinal commitment to the observation system that transcended mere material. The U.S. Army had institutionalized the forward observer role, establishing training schools, standardized procedures, and a culture that valued coordination over individual heroics. Every artillery officer received training in forward observation techniques. Every infantry battalion had assigned artillery liaison officers who understood how to request and adjust fire. The system was redundant, flexible, and remarkably resistant to disruption. By contrast, the Wehrmacht's artillery organization, for all its theoretical sophistication, proved brittle under the stresses of 1944 and 45. Losses of trained personnel could not be replaced. Radio equipment destroyed or captured could not be replenished. Ammunition expenditure, carefully rationed, never approached the levels necessary to achieve fire superiority. The system that had served adequately in the campaigns of 1939 through 1942 collapsed when confronted by an opponent whose artillery doctrine was specifically designed to achieve overwhelming concentration of fire through superior coordination. The final weeks of the war in Europe saw the jeep-mounted observation system operating at peak efficiency even as organized German resistance crumbled. Forward observers accompanied American units as they advanced into Czechoslovakia, Bavaria, and Austria, calling fire missions against increasingly desperate German defensive positions. The missions became shorter and more numerous. German units, surrounded and cut off, attempted to break out or surrender. Those that fought were destroyed by artillery that arrived with such speed that survivors spoke of shells falling from empty skies. Lieutenant Heinemann, whose diary had documented the descent into defeat, survived the war. He was captured by American forces near Regensburg on April 29, 1945, along with the remnants of his company. In his final diary entry, written in a prisoner of war camp in France 2 weeks after Germany's surrender, he reflected on the experience of fighting against American artillery. He wrote that the worst aspect had not been the violence itself, though that was terrible enough, but the sense of helplessness it created. To be observed was to be destroyed, and there was no way to avoid observation except to cease existing as a military force. He described the jeeps one final time. They had become, in his memory, symbols of a kind of warfare that reduced individual courage and tactical skill to irrelevance. The Americans, he wrote, had found a way to kill from beyond sight, beyond reach, beyond any possibility of response. The jeep with its radio was the instrument of this killing, but the real weapon was the system behind it, the vast machinery of coordination and firepower that the jeep merely represented. This understanding, expressed by a defeated German officer in a prison camp diary, captured the essence of what the jeep-mounted observation system had achieved. It had transformed artillery from a supporting arm into the dominant factor in ground combat. It had made movement suicidal and static defense untenable. It had created a battlefield environment where information and coordination were more valuable than armor or courage. And it had done so using a vehicle that weighed less than most motorcycles, armed with nothing but a radio and crewed by men whose primary weapons were mathematics and discipline. The legacy of this transformation extended far beyond World War II. Modern artillery doctrine, in every military that studied the American example, incorporated the lessons learned from the jeep-mounted forward observer system. The principle that observers must be mobile, well-equipped with reliable communications, and integrated into maneuver units became foundational to artillery employment. The Fire Direction Center concept evolved into computerized fire control systems capable of even greater speed and accuracy. But the fundamental insight, that coordination multiplies firepower far more effectively than increased numbers of guns, remained constant. In the museums and memorials of Europe, the jeep appears as a symbol of American mobility and mechanical ingenuity. Restored examples sit beside tanks and artillery pieces, identified by plaques that mention their roles in reconnaissance and transportation. Rarely do these displays acknowledge the Jeep's true significance as the critical node in the most lethal artillery system ever deployed. The vehicle's humble appearance, its lack of obvious weaponry, obscures the reality of what it accomplished. The farmhouse near Hatton, where this narrative began, stands as one of thousands of sites where the pattern repeated. A Jeep appeared. Shells fell. Men died. The Jeep departed. The cycle continued, day after day, from Normandy to the Elbe, until German resistance collapsed under accumulated losses that could neither be sustained nor avenged. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered most of Europe through aggressive maneuver and combined arms excellence, was systematically destroyed by an enemy whose artillery observers rode in unarmored trucks and whose doctrine prioritized information over impact. This paradox, that a vehicle designed for carrying cargo became the fulcrum of tactical dominance, reflects a larger truth about modern warfare. Technology matters less than the systems that employ it. Individual weapons matter less than the coordination that directs them. And in the calculus of industrial war, the ability to concentrate overwhelming force at the decisive point, guided by accurate information and executed with mechanized precision, proves more valuable than any amount of individual valor or tactical brilliance. The Jeep was never meant to be a weapon, but in the hands of forward observers, connected by radio to fire direction centers that could summon the fire of dozens of guns within minutes, it became the most feared vehicle on the Western Front. Not for what it could destroy directly, but for what it could summon. The Wehrmacht learned this truth slowly, painfully, through thousands of engagements where their positions were located, targeted, and annihilated by enemies they never saw using weapons they couldn't reach. By the time German commanders fully understood the system they faced, it was far too late to counter it. The Jeeps kept rolling, the radios kept transmitting, and the shells kept falling until the war's end. In the final analysis, the story of the Jeep-mounted forward observer is the story of how warfare changed in the 20th century. It is the story of information becoming as valuable as ammunition, of coordination becoming as powerful as firepower, and of a simple vehicle enabling a revolution in military effectiveness that altered the outcome of history's largest war. The Sherman tank may have attracted more attention. The Mustang fighter may have captured more imagination. But it was the Jeep, dismissed as useless by those who first encountered it, that killed more German soldiers and broke more German units than any other American weapon system in the European theater. That truth, uncomfortable and undramatic, is what makes the story worth remembering. The most lethal weapon is often the most overlooked. The most decisive innovations are often the least celebrated. And sometimes, the difference between victory and defeat comes down not to superior courage or better equipment, but to superior organization and the humble vehicles that make that organization possible. The Jeep proved all of this, one fire mission at a time, across the battlefields of Western Europe in the final year of the Second World War. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.